This story is a work of fiction. The characters and events depicted are entirely imaginary. She had not meant to go still. That was what she would remember later. Not the sound she did not make, not the color she felt leaving her face, not the way his hand tightened at her waist as though he registered the change in her before she knew it herself. She would remember only the particular quality of her own stillness. The waltz continued around them. The candles burned steadily in their silver holders. The faces of the other dancers turned in their careful arcs, noticing nothing. His name, not yet his voice would come later, but his name, spoken across the room in someone else's voice, clear and easy and entirely unaware of what it was doing. Your Grace, the Duke of Lowell. The music did not stop. The world did not stop. Rosalind Davenport simply became very, very still in the arms of a man she had spent 14 years pretending she had forgotten. His eyes found hers immediately, as though he had been watching for precisely this moment. Moss green, quiet, careful with a specific kind of care that had nothing to do with manners. He knew she had heard. She could see that he knew. She could also see in his face that he had been waiting for this, that he had spent the entire evening wondering when it would come. This is the story of what the 14 years between that night and this waltz had made of both of them. There are wounds that do not announce themselves. They scar over cleanly, grow a kind of protective surface that resembles strength, until the moment something presses precisely there, and everything old comes flooding back up from underneath. Rosalind Davenport built a life of quiet dignity on the foundation of one night's public humiliation. She made herself something, stone by careful stone, a small house, a small independence, a friendship worth more than most inheritances. She did not hate the man who had destroyed her first chance at belonging. She had over time accomplished something far more demanding. She had simply continued. And now a man with moss-green eyes has asked her to dance. The man is not a stranger at all. And she is beginning to understand that neither really is she. Tell me in the comments where you are tonight. The city, the hour. I read each one. The evening had begun, as most evenings Rosalind Davenport would rather have avoided, with a great deal of trouble over her hair. Her maid, Jenny, a girl of 18 with considerably more enthusiasm than precision, produced ringlets that required 3 separate attempts, an impressive quantity of pins, and one quietly withdrawn suggestion from Rosalind that perhaps the whole arrangement might be left to its own devices. The result, when achieved, was respectable. Side ringlets drawn back with a cream ribbon, a low chignon at the nape with 2 small curls allowed to fall free. Rosalind had sat through each attempt without complaint. She was practiced at patience. It was, she reflected, the skill she had worked hardest to acquire in the last 14 years, and the one she found most useful. She had come to Harrogate 6 months ago, carrying a small inheritance and a sincere intention to live quietly. This was not a plan she had explained to anyone, because explaining it required explaining what she had been doing before, and that was a thing Rosalind had not discussed since the year she had stopped crying about it. She was 31 years old. She had been many things in that time: a solicitor's daughter, a girl with season's hopes, a creature dismissed publicly at her own debut ball, a companion in Wiltshire, a companion in Derbyshire, and now, tentatively, with a care she extended to herself the way one extends a hand to a nervous animal, a woman of modest independent means in Yorkshire. Millicent Hale had found her within a fortnight of her arrival and had been attempting to correct her solitude ever since. Millicent was a doctor's wife, cheerful without being exhausting, curious without being invasive. She was perhaps the only person in Harrogate who regarded Rosalind's habitual quietness as a habit to be gently expanded rather than a character deficiency to be pitied. She had written 3 letters about the assembly at Linden Hall, each progressively less optional in tone. In the end, Rosalind had concluded that attending was simpler than the sustained effort of declining. The assembly rooms occupied the lower floor of Sir Robert Hargreaves's estate, which Sir Robert threw open each autumn to anyone of respectable connection. The company was varied, warm, and, mercifully, not London. Rosalind stood at the edge of the room in a gown of bronze silk, and observed the couples moving through a country dance with the particular attentiveness of someone who had no intention of participating. The bronze had been an extravagance. She had permitted herself exactly one since arriving in Harrogate. She was not unhappy. She wanted to be precise with herself about this. She was not the girl she had been at 17. That girl had stood in rooms like this one, with her heart entirely open and her hopes unguarded, and had believed, with the particular earnestness of the very young, that effort and grace and good intention were sufficient, that if you tried hard enough to be good, the world would eventually respond in kind. She had been disabused of that with some efficiency, but she had built something since. Small, solid, genuinely hers. She could stand in a room now and find it pleasant and go home afterward without mourning what had not happened. This was, she thought, no inconsiderable achievement. Millicent appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of punch and the expression of someone who had successfully completed a difficult negotiation. "There," she said. "You see, entirely manageable." "I did not require convincing that the room was manageable." "You required convincing that you should be in it." Millicent offered the punch with the serenity of someone who had already won. 60 people, none of them London. Mrs. Hargreaves's cousin plays the pianoforte and has not quite mastered the waltz tempo. There is cold salmon at the refreshment table, and it is reportedly excellent. You will be perfectly fine. Rosalind accepted the cup. "The salmon is cold because it is supposed to be cold. I was being enthusiastic." Millicent took her arm briefly, warmly. "You look lovely, Rosalind. You always look lovely when you stop arguing with yourself about it." This was a characteristic Millicent observation, kind and accurate, and entirely resistant to refutation. Rosalind drank her punch and returned her attention to the room. She did not notice him arrive. She became aware of him the way one becomes aware of a change in weather, not suddenly but gradually, a slight shift in the quality of the ambient air. He was standing near the far edge of the floor, half turned from the room, watching the dancing with what appeared to be genuine attention, rather than the performed attention of social obligation. He was tall and dark-haired, and held himself with an economy of movement she could not immediately account for. Not the studied stillness of arrogance, which she knew well and could identify across any ballroom, but something quieter than that. The ease of someone who had learned to occupy exactly the space they needed, and who did not require the room to acknowledge it. He was perhaps 35. His coat was dark and well cut without being ostentatious. He held his glass with one hand and kept the other in his coat pocket, and watched 2 couples attempt a country reel with the precise sort of attention that was not condescension but genuine interest. She could not have explained even to herself what distinguished these 2 things at such a distance. She simply observed that the distinction was there. His eyes, when he turned toward the candlelight, were an unusual color, green, the deep still green of moss on the shaded side of stone, the kind of color that does not announce itself. She was looking at him. She was aware she was looking. She continued for 1 beat longer than was wise, and then looked away with the promptness of long practice and directed her attention firmly to Millicent's account of the Hargreaves' plans for the south garden, which she had entirely failed to follow for the last 2 minutes. 5 minutes later, she heard a voice at her left shoulder, low and unhurried. "Forgive me. I wonder if this dance is promised." She turned. He was not quite as tall at close range as he had seemed across the room. His eyes were exactly the color she had thought. He was looking at her with the direct expression of someone who was actually asking rather than performing the asking. Rosalind Davenport had not danced in 4 years. She said, "It is not promised." She had not intended to say it. She said it anyway. And so the evening changed. He introduced himself as Leander. No surname, which at a country assembly was slightly unusual, most men offering at least a family name as a kind of social tether. But he offered only the one, and Rosalind, who had spent years keeping her own name carefully singular, found she could not object to the principle. The dance was a waltz. She had known it would be, from the moment she said yes. There was a certain inevitability to such moments, a click of internal machinery that assembled the most intimate option available. His hand at the small of her back was warm through the bronze silk, steady without being presumptuous. Her gloved hand rested in his. 3 feet of charged air required by the form of the dance, which the music seemed quietly determined to make feel like less. He danced with attention, not with the practiced competence of duty, but with something closer to genuine interest in the thing itself, the particular physics of two people moving together in time. She noticed this because she had danced over the years with a great many men whose bodies were on the floor while their attention was somewhere else entirely. "You are visiting Sir Robert?" she asked, because the silence had acquired a weight that wanted addressing. "For the fortnight." His voice was even, unhurried. "And yourself?" "I live in Harrogate, on Crane Street." "Recently?" "6 months." He absorbed this with a small nod and then said, "Do you like it?" The plainness of the question surprised her. People in new acquaintance ask such things as formality, as the necessary performance of social interest, and expected the necessary performance of social satisfaction in return. He was looking at her as though he actually wanted to know. "I do," she said, and then, because he had somehow made it feel safe to be honest, "I came from a very different kind of life, quieter here, fewer demands." "Fewer eyes," he said. She looked at him. "Yes, exactly that." Something moved in his expression, a small and private shift she could not name. He looked briefly at the space between them, at their joined hands, then back at her face. "I understand that," he said, and offered nothing more. They completed almost a full circle of the room in silence after that. She found the silence unexpectedly comfortable. Not the effortful silence of two people managing each other's presence, but the quieter kind. Two people who have both arrived somewhere and are not rushing to leave it. "You did not want to come tonight," he said when the waltz was 3/4 done. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. I mean it as an observation only." His expression was entirely even, not a reproach. He glanced briefly around the room. There is a particular quality of attention that a person gives to a place when they are deciding whether to remain in it. You have been assessing this room since you arrived, not unhappily, but assessing. She regarded him for a moment. That is a very precise thing to notice about someone you have known for 7 minutes. 8. The corner of his mouth moved. "I have been watching you since you came in. I found I could not stop." Other men had said versions of this. It had never sounded like this. It sounded, from him, simply like information he was offering, in the spirit of accuracy rather than in the spirit of flattery. "Why?" she asked. He considered this with a seriousness she had not anticipated. "Because you were the most honest person in the room," he said. "Everyone else was performing something. You were assessing whether the room was worth performing for." She thought about what she wished she could say, which was, "I have been performing for rooms that turned out not to be worth it, and I have learned the cost." She said instead, "That is either a compliment or an observation about my manners, and I cannot decide which." "Both, perhaps." He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, neither intended unkindly. The music began its final passage. She became aware of the warmth of his hand at her back, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of performance in it. He was not pressing closer. He was not performing proximity. He was simply there, with her, with an attentiveness that required nothing in return. The waltz ended. He released her with the precise propriety required, offered a small bow, and she curtsied, and they stood in the brief stillness that follows a dance before the room's noise closed back in. "May I bring you some refreshment?" he asked. "No," she said. A pause in which she surprised herself. "Yes, thank you. I think I would like that." His expression held the quality, very briefly, of someone who had been prepared to accept a negative and was not prepared for a positive. Then he smiled, actually smiled, and it rearranged his face entirely, and went to find her something to drink. They drifted into the conservatory without either of them suggesting it, carried there by the natural physics of two people who had been talking and were not yet ready to stop, and also did not want to be watched doing it. The glass-panelled doors were propped open to the warm evening, and the conservatory beyond smelled of damp stone and night-blooming jasmine, and the particular cool green scent of growing things in an enclosed space. 2 oil lamps lit it dimly. The voices from the assembly rooms came through muffled, the music reduced to something rhythmic and distant. He found her a small iron chair near the jasmine, the slightly rusted sort, that every conservatory seems to accumulate over time, as though the chairs grow there naturally in the dark. She sat. He stood nearby with his glass. She held her punch cup. Neither of them was in any hurry to fill the space with unnecessary words. The jasmine moved in some small current of air from the open door. A moth circled one of the lamps with the focused persistence of something that had made a decision and could not unmake it. "You are carrying something," he said. Not a question. She looked at the flowers rather than his face. "Everyone carries something." "Yes." He was looking at the window, the dark garden beyond. "But most people carry it tucked in. You carry yours in the manner of someone who has carried it so long they have forgotten it is there." She ought to have found this presumptuous. She was aware she ought to. He had known her for 35 minutes. "You might be describing yourself," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I might be." The lamplight lay across the angle of his jaw, the line of his shoulder. She was aware with a clarity that was slightly inconvenient that he was not merely good-looking in the way that men at assemblies were good-looking, expensively dressed, sufficiently groomed. There was something in his face that had been lived in, lines at the corners of his eyes that were not merely age but thought, the particular quality of features that have felt things for a long time. "I was someone different once," she said. The words arrived without her planning them. She looked at the jasmine, at the waxy white stars of the flowers in the dim light. "In London, when I was young, I believed, rather completely, that if one was earnest and careful and tried genuinely to do well, the world would respond accordingly." She paused. The familiar compression in her chest, small, habitual, the way one presses a bruise to confirm it is still there. "I was given reason to revise that belief." She had expected him to say something consoling. People usually did. He said nothing. He waited with a quality of attention she felt in her chest before she fully registered it in her mind. He was not managing her. He was listening. "Something happened," she said. "At a debut, my own. I was 17. She kept her eyes on the flowers. "Something was said, by someone with no particular reason to be cruel, who was cruel anyway, publicly. And I went home. And I did not return to London again for 6 years, and when I did, it was as a companion, and I never—" She stopped. "I was not able to be a beginning after that. I was only ever in the middle of someone else's story." He said, "What did it take from you?" She looked at him. The question was so direct, so plainly genuine, that it took her a full moment to respond. No one had ever asked her that. Not once in 14 years. They had offered consolation, minimization, cheerful pragmatism, the various kinds of kindness that amount to not looking directly at the thing. "My first year," she said quietly. "The ordinary chances of an ordinary first season. Introductions, a chance at something. I do not know exactly what it would have been, but the chance." She turned back to the jasmine. "My mother was very kind. She said London society was not worth the candle. She was right. But she was right in the way that people are right when they are trying to make something bearable that has already happened." He did not speak immediately. She had the sense that he was doing something careful with his own face. "I am sorry," he said, quietly. Nothing added to it. "You did not do it," she said. A pause. Something crossed his expression, swift and difficult to read in the lamplight. The doors opened. Millicent's voice preceded her by several feet. "There you are, Rosalind. Sir Robert was asking about—" "Oh." She stopped, assessed the room with the precision of a woman who has always been considerably more perceptive than she let on. "I will tell him you are admiring the jasmine," she said, and retreated. The moment had changed. They both felt it. Rosalind stood. "I should go back in." "Yes." He stood too. Then as she moved toward the door, "Miss Davenport." She turned. He was standing with his glass and his careful face and his moss-green eyes, and the expression of a man who had decided to say the simple thing rather than the complicated one. "I am glad you said yes to the dance," he said. She considered this for a full beat before answering. "So am I," she said, surprisingly. She did not dance again that evening. She returned to the assembly rooms with Millicent's hand on her arm, and Millicent's deliberate and entirely transparent not asking of questions, and she stood at the edge of the floor and felt something she had not felt in a very long time and could not immediately name. Not happiness, it was not so simple as happiness. More the particular sensation of a window opened in a room that had been sealed for too long. The air rushing in, welcome and slightly alarming, carrying something from outside that the room had not contained before. She was careful not to watch him. She watched him anyway, in the manner of someone who was being very careful not to watch. He was at the far end of the room, speaking with a pair of gentlemen she did not know. Something in his posture as he spoke, attentive, unhurried, was recognizable to her already, and she found this simultaneously pleasing and unsettling. She did not know anything about him. She knew his Christian name and the color of his eyes, and the way he listened with his entire body when he was genuinely listening. And this constituted more than she had permitted herself to know about another person in several years. The evening continued in the way of such evenings. The music, the dancing, the warm, comfortable hum of conversation, the gradual diminishment of the refreshment table. Rosalind declined 2 further invitations to dance, kindly, and accepted a second cup of punch, and stood with Millicent through a pleasant enough exchange about the comparative merits of Harrogate versus Bath, and felt herself almost simply present. Not performing, not managing the room. Present. Then, perhaps an hour after they had returned from the conservatory, a man crossed the floor with the brisk purpose of someone who had finally located the person he had been looking for. He was stout and red-faced, and pleased with himself in the particular way of men who were important enough in their own county that they had stopped considering whether their importance was felt as a pleasure by anyone else. He seized Leander's hand with vigor and spoke at a volume calibrated for a room twice the size. "Your Grace, the Duke of Lowell." The rest of the sentence dissolved entirely. The room did not change. The musicians did not falter. Millicent said something beside her. She saw Millicent's mouth move, felt the touch of Millicent's hand on her sleeve, and processed none of it. 30 feet away, Leander turned his head, and his eyes found hers across the entire crowded floor. Immediately, directly, without any searching. He had been watching for this. He had been watching for the precise moment when she would hear. She saw it in his face. Not surprise, not guilt caught in the act, but the particular expression of a man who had been waiting for the bill to arrive and finds, now that it was here, that he was not as prepared as he believed. He had known. He had known this moment was coming, and he had chosen to let it come rather than to force it, and she understood, in the same breath that her chest tightened and her hands went cold, that this was a kind of honesty. He could have told her his full name at the beginning of the dance. He had not. He had let her come to know him first, in whatever small way 2 people can come to know each other in 3/4 of a waltz and an hour in a conservatory. And she did not know yet whether to be grateful for that or to be angry about it. She thought very clearly and quite uselessly. His surname. I never asked his surname. Your Grace, Duke Lowell. The floor of the assembly room at Linden Hall dissolved without moving and became another floor entirely. A garden. Spring night, 14 years ago. The smell of cut grass and candle wax drifting from the house. She had gone into the garden because the flowers were extraordinary. Bunches of cream and pink peonies against the wall. And she had thought only that the retiring room would be brightened considerably by a small arrangement. And she had cut 6 blooms and turned toward the house, and there had been a man in the shadow of the cedar tree. A dark coat, not a footman. She had understood this the moment she saw his face, too late to stop walking toward him. She had held out the flowers with 17-year-old earnestness and said, "I believe these belong inside," and he had looked at her with a contempt that did not require effort because it had never required effort in his life, and he had said, clearly, carrying to anyone within earshot, "Who allowed that creature in here?" The room had heard. Her mother had heard. 2 girls in white she had hoped to befriend had heard, and their expressions had shifted in a way she had not forgotten. She had walked out of the garden. She had walked to the hired carriage. She had told her mother she was unwell, which was true in ways she did not have words for at 17, and in the morning she had packed her trunk, and they had gone home, and she had not returned to London again until she was 23, and in service to another family and invisible by design. Millicent's hand on her arm. Rosalind. Very quiet. I am perfectly well. Her voice was steady. She had spent 14 years practicing the steadiness. I find I am rather tired. Would you mind if we went? She did not look back across the room. She thought she felt his eyes following her. She did not look. She did not leave. She intended to. She sent Millicent for her wrap and stood in the corridor outside the assembly rooms and experienced the particular paralysis of someone who had made a decision and immediately doubted it, not because she wanted to remain, but because she did not know precisely where she wanted to go, and the corridor was quiet and empty and asked nothing of her, and this, for the moment, was enough. She heard his footsteps before she turned, unhurried, deliberate, not running. She would have resented running, not performing nonchalance either, simply walking toward her because he had decided to. Miss Davenport. She turned. He was 5 feet away with his hands at his sides and his face open in a way it had not been at any point in the assembly room. The control was still there. She could see the effort of maintaining it, but whatever it was controlling was very close to the surface. I am leaving, she said. I know. He did not move toward her. I will not keep you, but I want to say something, and I think I would rather say it now, while I am still capable of it. The corridor was empty. Through the closed doors came the muffled rhythm of the next dance. She did not walk away. He said, In 14 years I have not forgotten the night of your debut. The words arrived with physical weight. Her hands tightened around her own fingers. You were in the garden, he said. You had cut some flowers. You were... He stopped. You were so very much in earnest. His voice carried something she could not name. And I was... He stopped again, tried differently. I had received word that evening that my mother was dying. I had come from a meeting with our solicitors about what would remain when she was gone. I was furious and I was frightened, and I had no right to be either of those things at a party, and yet I was there, and you were there, and I... He pressed his lips together. I said something that I have not, in any subsequent year, forgiven myself for saying. Rosalind said nothing. I did not learn your name, he said. That is the worst of it. Not the worst of what I did, but the worst of the aftermath. You were gone. I asked several people, and no one seemed to know precisely whose guest you were. You had already left, and I had no... He exhaled. I am sorry. I am aware that saying so 14 years later in a corridor in Harrogate is essentially useless, but I have needed to say it to you specifically, and I could not, and now I can, and I am. The silence between them was very complete. Who allowed that creature in here? She said very quietly. He closed his eyes. Yes, I was 17. I know. I had cut the flowers because I thought they would brighten the retiring room. I thought I was being useful. She listened to herself speak in the calm, even voice she had made of the old wound. I went home the next morning. I did not attend another season. She stopped. I became a companion for many years. I became very good at being invisible. He was very still. What did it cost you? He asked. She looked at him sharply. It was almost the same question he had asked in the conservatory. She realized he had been asking it there too, in the sideways way of someone who does not yet know how to ask directly. My chance at an ordinary life, she said. I do not know exactly what that life would have contained, but I do not think it would have contained 14 years of being someone's companion. She looked at the wall. My mother was kind about it. She said I was better suited to independence. She was probably right. A pause. But she was right after the fact, and that is a different kind of right. He was looking at her with a quality of attention that was almost painful. Why are you here? She said. Tonight in Harrogate. Sir Robert Hargreaves was at Oxford with my brother. He has invited me each autumn for a decade. A pause. I did not know you were here. I could not have known. No. But you are here, he said. And I am here. And I said your name wrong to every person I asked after you, and I never found you. And 14 years later, you walked across a room in bronze silk, and you were the most honest person in the room, and I... He stopped. She looked at him for a long time. You have had all this time to think about it, she said slowly. Yes. And I, she said, have had all this time trying to stop. She looked at her hands. I am not certain which of us fared worse in that arrangement. Something in him, she saw it, released very slightly, like a door opening a small degree. Go home, Miss Davenport, he said quietly. I will not impose further. She moved past him toward the entrance. At the door she stopped. She did not look at him. Leander, she said. She felt him go entirely still. Thank you, she said, for telling me. And she walked out into the cool night, and the air was clean and cold on her face, and she walked the whole way to Crane Street without once looking back. She did not sleep. She sat in the small parlour of the house on Crane Street, with the fire burning down to red coals, and a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her, and the particular wakefulness of someone who has had a significant thing given back to them and does not yet know how to hold it. She had carried this wound in the manner she described. Like a coat worn so long it no longer felt separate from herself. She had shaped her life around its edges. She had moved to places where no one knew, and so could not wonder. She had cultivated invisibility the way other women cultivated accomplishments, with patience and consistency, and a kind of grim satisfaction in her own proficiency. She was good at it. She had not understood until tonight that being good at invisibility is not a virtue. It is a wound that has learned to pass as a skill, and all this time he had known what he had done. Her first feeling walking home had been anger. Not the hot kind. She had felt that once at 17 and burned through it in the months after, and come out the other side of it changed, permanently altered in some structural way, like timber that has warped in water and dried at a new angle. This was the preserved kind, the kind kept in a very still place for a very long time. It tasted, when it surfaced, more like grief than fury. He had known, and she had not known he knew, and that asymmetry had its own particular quality. She had assumed, because how could one not assume, that she was entirely forgettable, that the creature in the garden had been dismissed from his mind with the next thought and never revisited. She had built much of her emotional architecture on that assumption. It had not been a comforting architecture, but it had been a stable one. She had known what to expect from it. She was not sure what to do now that it was gone. She thought about his face in the corridor, the effort in it, the deliberate openness of a man who has decided to do a difficult thing and is doing it as honestly as he can manage. He had not asked for forgiveness. She had noticed this, had been noticing it since the moment he began to speak, and it continued to matter. He had not said, "Please forgive me," or "I hope you can understand," or "I was not myself that night," any of the things people say when they want absolution without having earned it. He had simply stated what was true. This is what happened. This is what I have carried since. This is what I could not repair because I could not find you, and I could not find you because I did not know your name, and I did not know your name because I had not thought to learn it before I spoke. She thought about his mother, Catherine, dying 3 weeks after that party, the fury of a man who has just been told that the person he is losing is already mostly lost, and has no idea how to hold the weight of that knowledge in a body that must still walk through a room and make conversation, and shake hands and pretend that everything is as it should be. She did not excuse him. She held the thought at arm's length and examined it with care, and confirmed, no. A man in grief does not have the right to destroy a girl at 17, because the grief has no better place to go. This was true, and she would not soften it. But she understood it. Understanding was not the same as excusing. It was something else, something quieter and more complicated. The beginning of a different relationship to the event, one in which she was not only the recipient of it, not only defined by what it had made of her. She had never been able to see it from the outside before. She had been inside it for 14 years. She thought about the waltz, the particular quality of his stillness in it, and the quality of her own response, which had been something she had not felt in a very long time. The simple and slightly alarming pleasure of being in a room and not managing it. Not performing, not calculating, not assessing the exits, simply present in the specific way that requires another person's genuine attention to make possible. She thought about the question he had asked her twice without using the same words. What did it cost you? No one in 14 years had asked her that. Not her mother, who loved her and was careful with her. Not the families she had worked for, who were pleasant and oblivious. Not Millicent, who was the best friend she had, and who understood more than she showed, but who had always, wisely, waited to be told. No one had asked, because no one had assumed it might be worth knowing. She thought this might matter considerably more than she was ready to admit at midnight, in a cold parlour, with a cup of tea that had been wrong temperature for the last hour. The fire collapsed into itself with a small shower of sparks. The coal settled and the room dimmed. Outside the window, Harrogate was silent in the deep of the autumn night, and Rosalind Davenport sat with her hands in her lap and thought about costs and what one does when the accounting is finally laid out plainly, and whether she was the kind of woman, had ever been, might still become, who could choose to begin again from the middle. She almost did not go to the Tuesday gathering. The invitation had come through Millicent, delivered with the carefully studied casualness of someone who very much wants to appear as though she is not trying. Sir Robert and Lady Hargreaves, dinner for 20, informal dancing to follow. Millicent had produced the card with the air of setting down a cup of tea. Nothing remarkable here, simply an object that exists, and which Rosalind might or might not choose to acknowledge. "He will be there," Rosalind said. Millicent did not pretend to misunderstand. "I expect so. You know who he is. I know he is the Duke of Lowell, that he was at Oxford with Sir Robert's eldest, that he has been a widower for 3 years. A pause. I also know that you walked home from Saturday's assembly, looking as though someone had rearranged all the furniture inside your head, and that you have been very quiet since, and that you have not touched the novel you were reading." Rosalind looked at her. "I am not pushing," Millicent said with great care. "I am only offering you the card. What you do with it is entirely your own affair." She went. She wore the bronze silk again, for the simple reason that she had nothing else warranting the occasion. She arrived in Millicent's carriage in the early dark, with the feeling of someone who has made a decision and has chosen not to examine it too closely before acting on it, because too close examination has historically resulted in her spending the evening with a novel instead. The dinner was pleasant and entirely undemanding. She was seated at the opposite end of the table from him, by chance or design she could not determine, and spent the meal in excellent conversation with a Mr. and Mrs. Pendleton of Knaresborough, who were cheerful and direct and wanted only to know her opinion of the fish, which she gave honestly. She ate. She drank a glass of wine. She was, by any external measure, composed. Then the covers were removed, and the company moved to the drawing-room, and the musicians were already arranged in the corner, and Rosalind set down her glass and thought, with a clarity that came suddenly and entirely, now. She crossed the room toward him. He was standing near the windows, the same position as Saturday, near the edge, watching, and when he saw her coming, something happened in his expression that he did not have time to arrange. He had been prepared, she could see, for the possibility that she would not come, had perhaps spent 3 days making his peace with it. She stopped in front of him. His moss-green eyes held a question he would not ask. She said, "I have been thinking." "Yes." Very quiet. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what 14 years costs when you spend them in a particular posture." She looked briefly at the room around them, the dancers, the candles, the warm, comfortable, ordinary scene of it. "I have been very careful," she said, "for a very long time. Very careful not to be seen or known or to give anyone the kind of access to me that would allow what happened before to happen again." She returned her eyes to his. "I have been correct and careful and entirely small." His expression did not change, but something behind it did. "I have made myself small," she said, "and I find I no longer wish to do that." He waited. "I am not forgiving you tonight," she said. "Forgiveness is... I am not yet ready for what forgiveness requires of me. But I would like..." She paused and let the next words arrive honestly. "I would like to dance, if the offer still stands." "It will always stand," he said. She took his hand. The music was a waltz. She did not know if this was chance. She suspected it was not entirely chance. Some evenings seemed to be arranged with an intention she would feel presumptuous naming. The room, the light, the key of the music, the particular quality of the air in this smaller drawing room, lower ceilinged and warmer than the assembly rooms at Linden Hall, the candles closer, the other dancers fewer, all of it conspiring toward something that the people in the room had perhaps been moving toward all along. This time the dance was different. On Saturday, it had been electric. The awareness of a stranger who might become something. The charged alertness of two people taking each other's measure across 3 feet of required distance. This was quieter than that, more real. His hand at her back and her hand in his, and she did not attempt to manage what that meant. She did not assess it or calculate it or decide in advance what she was willing to feel. She simply felt it, the warmth of his palm through the silk of her gown, the unhurried rhythm of his steps, the way he did not crowd her and did not retreat from her. The way the room, which had been a series of faces to manage all evening, resolved in the compass of his attention into something she did not need to think about. She had forgotten that this was possible, that a room could require so little of her. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, when they had been turning for half a minute. "Yes, I am aware. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not sure what the appropriate form of repair looks like after so long." She thought about this seriously. "I do not think there is an appropriate form," she said. "Repair implies the thing can be restored to what it was." She looked at their joined hands. "It cannot be. No. But something can be built," she said slowly, feeling the thought arrive as she spoke it. "Something different, not instead of what was lost. Just something else." His hand tightened briefly at her waist. Unconscious, she thought, unrehearsed. "Would you allow me to call on you?" he asked. She thought about the house on Crane Street, the small parlor with the fire and the cold tea, the 14 years of careful smallness, the question he had asked her twice, that no one else had ever asked her once. "I will think about it," she said. He accepted this with a nod that contained, she thought, more relief than he intended to show. She thought it was rather a great deal to accept. They finished the dance. He brought her champagne she had not asked for, and which she drank because it was cold and the room was warm, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely uncertain what happened next. And uncertainty, she was discovering, had a flavor she had forgotten. It was not entirely unpleasant. The weeks that followed had a quality Rosalind could not name, and did not try to. He called on a Thursday the first week. He sat in the small parlor on Crane Street and drank tea that was not cold. She had made a particular effort about the tea. And they spoke for an hour about books, and about Harrogate, and about his estate in Wiltshire that he had not visited in 2 years, because it held memories of his late wife that he had not yet found a way through. He spoke of her without sentimentality, and without the careful blankness of a man who has decided not to feel anything about it. He had loved her. He had lost her. He was still finding out what that meant. She found she did not mind hearing about this. She spoke about her years in Derbyshire, the quality of light on the moors in November, that particular flat grey-blue that is unlike any other light in England, the way the horizon goes soft and the distance seems to breathe. The family she had worked for, who were not unkind. The way solitude over a long enough time stops being a wound and begins to feel like a room you have furnished carefully, adjusted to your own particular dimensions and habits. You can live in it without much difficulty. The difficulty is that you stop noticing you have become very small. He listened the way he always listened, with his whole body, saying nothing until she was finished, and then saying something that proved he had heard. He came back the following week, and the week after that. He did not return to the subject of the garden and the flowers, not once in all the weeks that followed. She noticed this and understood it completely. The subject was hers to raise when she was ready, and he had decided that waiting indefinitely was a cost he was willing to pay. He simply came. He drank tea. He talked to her as though she were interesting, which she was, though she had spent 14 years in households where this was not treated as a given. The 4th week he brought her a book he thought she might find useful, a travel account of the Wiltshire Downs, his part of the country, which she would have found eccentric from anyone else, and found instead strangely thoughtful. The 5th week it rained, and they sat in the parlour for 2 hours longer than either of them had planned, and discovered they could not agree about Milton, and that this was, unexpectedly, enjoyable. In the 6th week, she raised the subject herself. They were walking on the edge of the Stray, the long stretch of common ground that ran through the centre of town, and the afternoon was cold and clear and pale as winter bone. Their breath made small separate clouds in the sharp air. A dog belonging to no one in particular was investigating something at the far end of the path. The church tower stood against a sky the colour of pewter. She said, without preceding it, "I have been thinking about what forgiveness actually is." He did not flinch. He did not make an expression. He simply said, "And?" "I think I have been waiting for it to erase the thing," she said. "I thought that forgiving would mean that what happened would cease to matter, that the event would be somehow undone." She looked at the cold grass under their feet, the frost still in the shade of the hedge. "But it happened, and it shaped me, and I cannot undo the shaping." He walked beside her and waited. "But I can decide what the shaping means," she said slowly. "I can decide whether that night is the last word on who I am, or whether it is simply something that occurred, a thing done to me without my consent, which I survived, and which is a part of my history but not the whole of it." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him in the pale afternoon light, his dark coat, the frost-crisped grass under his boots, his moss-green eyes holding the particular quality of attention she had come to rely on more than she had intended. "I have survived it," she said, "for 14 years. I am tired of only surviving it." "What would it look like," he said quietly, "if you were not only surviving?" She looked at the Stray, at the church tower, at the cold, clear sky above Harrogate, at him. "It would look like this," she said. "I think it would look something very much like this." He reached out and took her gloved hand, not asking, not announcing it, simply taking it with the care of someone who understands exactly what they are holding and is determined not to be careless with it. They walked back toward Crane Street in the late afternoon, and the cold was clean and real and entirely present, and Rosalind Davenport thought, "I have forgiven him." Not in the way she had imagined forgiveness, not as a sudden release, not as an erasure, not as the definitive sound of something locking shut. As a choosing, quiet and deliberate and made without drama, the way most important decisions are made, without anyone watching, in a cold afternoon, on a path that goes somewhere ordinary. The choosing to let the 14 years be what they were, and to let this be something else entirely. She had not expected this. She thought, walking back toward the house on Crane Street, with his hand warm around her gloved fingers, that perhaps not expecting it was the whole point. In the spring of the following year, the residents of Harrogate noted, with varying degrees of understanding and considerably varying degrees of success in suppressing their curiosity, that the rather private woman on Crane Street had become the Duchess of Lowell. The ceremony was small. Millicent Hale, visibly delighted, wore primrose yellow. Sir Robert Hargreaves served as a witness and spent the entire morning with the air of someone who had arranged something without technically having arranged anything. The minister was pleasant. They were married on a Tuesday because Rosalind had decided after some reflection that she preferred Tuesdays. London society could not quite account for it. The Duke of Lowell had been expected to remarry. He was expected to do most things in the correct order and at the correct time, being that sort of duke, but a Miss Davenport of Harrogate was entirely unknown to anyone who mattered, and inquiries into her history encountered the deliberate blankness that a woman produces when she has spent 14 years making herself difficult to find. Those who had attended the Linden Hall Assembly that autumn pretended with considerable care not to remember the particulars. It seemed the most tactful response. Rosalind Davenport, Rosalind Lowell, now Duchess, mistress of a great house in Wiltshire she was learning to love, room by patient room, kept no formal record of how it had started. She wrote no account of that evening, saved no letter that described it. She kept only the memory, a waltz, a floor, candlelight, the moment a name crossed a room like a stone through still water, and the extraordinary, entirely unexpected thing she had done in the moment after it, which was to choose not to run. She had spent 14 years running and 6 months standing still, and one autumn learning that stillness and movement are not, in the end, opposites, where every gesture is a poem.